So I think we might just get started. First of all, welcome, and thanks everyone for your interest in the first of what we're hoping will be a series of online seminars looking at issues in the sociology of youth. The response to our invitation was amazing. We've got a lot of people attending this online seminar. It shows that there's still a real appetite for conversations, even though international travel and face-to-face academic conversations are harder to have these days. So we're thrilled that we were able to put this together. I'll just give you a really brief rundown of what motivates the seminar and how this is going to run. And then we'll just get straight into it. So this seminar has been organised collaboratively by the Newcastle Youth Studies Network and the Consortium for Youth, Generations and Culture. And the Newcastle Youth Studies Network is an international network which brings together researchers and collaborators from around the world who are connected with us at the University of Newcastle in Australia. We were hoping to have an international event to launch the network. However, obviously circumstances prevented that, but this series of online seminars is a great opportunity to connect internationally anyway. And we are collaborating with the Consortium for Youth, Generations and Culture, which is an Australian multi-institutional consortium of youth researchers. So the seminar today will feature three international scholars. We have Kaisa Vehkalahti from the University of Oulu in Finland, Valentina Cuzzocrea from the University of Cagliari in Italy, and Johanna from the University of Melbourne in Melbourne. Each presenter will talk for 15 minutes, and then we'll take questions all the way at the end. The theme for the seminar is issues connected with social change in the sociology of youth, theoretical problems in understanding social change, notions of social generations, and debates on ideas in those areas. As I said, we'll do the three papers one by one. If you have questions or comments for our presenters, please just write them in the text chat, and I and my colleagues at Newcastle will be watching the text chat and we'll deliver them to our presenters. And also please bear with us if there are any technical problems during the event. We ask you all please to keep your mics muted as well while the presenters are talking, so that we don't get any kind of background noise. We wish the event is scheduled to go for about 90 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So as I said, please do write your questions and comments in the text chat so that our presenters can respond to them when it's time. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Kaisa, who is our first presenter for the workshop. So Kaisa, over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to participate in this online seminar. I'm currently working with research themes that are related to the history of rural youth. My background is in cultural history, not exactly in sociology, but I have also been interested in generations and in social change, but particularly in the rural context. And now I'm trying to I wonder if I can share my screen. Just hold on for a second. Sorry, but now you should see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, finally. Right. Sorry, it takes some time.
Thank you.
So for this presentation, I've been looking at how people who witnessed a considerable social change in their youth have narrated those years afterwards. My focus today is on life writings of the oldest generation, so to speak, that is included in my current study. They were born just before or after the Second World War and witnessed a very rapid change from agrarian to modern industrialized society during their youth and young adulthood. So how do they remember and narrate the post-war rural youth? And more specifically, what kinds of temporalities can be found in their narratives? How do they discuss time and social change they witnessed? But first of all, I think I need to put you on a map. Here we have Europe and the population density in Europe. And the darker the area is, the more densely populated the areas are. And here we have Finland. Today, Finland is among the most rural OECD countries with regard to the proportion of rural areas and also rural population. Historical link between rurality and agriculture, however, has broken. Today, only 3.3% of the Finnish labor force is employed directly in agriculture and forestry. However, compared to other European countries, urbanization took place quite late and also rapidly, as you can see in this chart. The yellow line represents Finnish population, and the blue line, rural population that gained income from agriculture or forestry. In 1950, over 46% of Finns made their living from traditional agriculture and forestry. Substantial migration from countryside to bigger villages and abroad, most notably to Sweden, started in the 1960s when the children born on these small farms grew up and agrarian labor market collapsed at the same time due to mechanization of agriculture. In the 1960s, drastic changes in the Finnish economy launched a depopulation of rural communities, which in the Finnish history is known as the years of great migration. So if we are looking for a social change, the grand narrative of Finnish countryside is definitely one. More importantly, rural depopulation was significantly a youth movement. It has been estimated that nearly every second baby boomer born in rural Finland moved to cities or emigrated between the ages of 15 and 30. My empirical material consists of written autobiographies depicting childhood and youth in post-war rural Finland. This material was collected through a national writing contest a few years ago. Life writing calls are a specifically Finnish method of collecting memory-based research material. The Finnish Literature Society has collected written traditions since the 19th century, and it's a huge archive. In this call, which was called Generations of Youth, we received 376 autobiographies from people of different ages, with those born in the 1930s and 40s being the largest group.
Kaisa, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your slides changing. We can't see your slides changing. Is your screen frozen?
Ah, okay.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. If this is a technical issue that we can't sort out really easily, then that's fine. We can just listen to you speak. But if it can be fixed easily, then
maybe it's good to start it over again.
Maybe share your screen again.
And
yeah,
did you see the map?
Working. Yes, that's working.
Yeah,
did you? Fantastic. Somebody perhaps more technically minded than me has said that you need to be full screen, apparently. So.
Well, I would just recommend, if I may, I'm sorry, you put a slideshow, then it will be full screen and it would be easier.
Yes, that's actually what I did.
Okay.
Well, let's see how we go. It seems to be working now, and if it stops working again, well, that's fine. I won't interrupt again. We'll just listen.
Maybe maybe if I don't put it on a slideshow, maybe this way you can see the slides. Yep. Can you see the
change? Give that a go. That's working now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's only that it's so small, but maybe.
That's okay. Thank you. I'm going to mute again.
Okay. So maybe I go on. I'll just show the map. This was the map that I showed just in my first slide. So the map of Europe, and there you can see where Finland is situated. And now I'm moving to the methodological questions. So maybe I do it like this and just continue with the presentation. So methodologically, this analysis draws on the interconnected theoretical fields of oral history tradition and memory studies. The way I see memory is that memory is not just about recalling past events. It is an active process in which you reconstruct the time and the events in the present time, calling up images, stories, experiences, but also organizing them, placing them within a narrative or a story, and then telling them in a way that is understandable in our current cultural context. Now, if we look at youth as a life phase through the lenses of an oral historian, we could say that youth is a life phase that never really stops. Childhood and youth experiences gain new interpretations and meanings throughout our lives. On personal level, memories are reinterpreted against later phases in life. On the collective level, memories are situated and interpreted against collectively shared narratives. And it's also interesting how youth experiences can be interpreted differently in different life phases. This is something I'm going to discuss through some empirical examples today. Although a variety of themes could be discussed, I have picked 3 central types of narratives that illustrate how time and change is presented in the narratives of rural youth. The first one is a rather paradoxical one, as social change is hardly anywhere in this type of narratives. The following quote is from an autobiography by a woman who was born in 1948. She writes, "A soft breeze swayed the hay and a strong scent was in the air, ears of rye, daisies, and the scent of some strong grass growing by the trenches. There was a river by the field, the river of our childhood and youth, and if you walked by the trenches towards it, you could hear a soft purl as the low water swirled over the stones, finally setting into a swimming pond, our own deep swimming pond." This text is an illuminating example of a narrative in which temporal distance completely disappears and the author is able to step back in time. The idyllic rural landscape is described as unchanged, almost eternal. Time and nature are linked by strong emotions and senses. In these narratives, rurality and nature are presented as something essential parts of who the authors are, and in this connection, has also survived through times. In some cases, this plot seems to exclude the social change completely. The rural past is a picture where time has stopped. Sometimes the narratives include rather sudden, unexplained ruptures and time leaps. The author moves away from the idyllic landscape for education or work, but in her memories, the rural idyll is always there. It is both lost and eternal at the same time. Despite of being portrayed as very intimate and very personal, this type of stories may also make use of more widely shared models of narrating the past. For one, childhood and youth nostalgia is a very common cultural script. You can find it almost anywhere, not only in Finland. Secondly, Idealized descriptions of rural landscape also have many literary models in the Finnish culture. It is also important to note that in the Finnish context, nostalgia does not seem to exclude recognition of social problems such as hard work or poverty. In many texts, hardships of the rural way of life are present, yet rural youth may nevertheless evoke positive memories and place attachment. While the social change is nowhere to be seen in some narratives, some others are constructed around the very theme. The author of the following extract writes extensively about how building of a sawmill brought his old village to a modern time. In the end of his text, he summarizes what it meant for himself. For me, the son of a poor tenant farmer, the sawmill that was built some half kilometers away from my home was a springboard for the standard of living that I can enjoy today. I'm a happy pensioner living close to a golf course. And then he writes about the standard of living he has gained. In this narrative, change is inevitable and it is also for the best, whereas in some other stories, authors talk about forced migration and lost hopes of being able to support oneself in the countryside. This author, however, also places himself in a grand narrative of post-war Finland as a successful representative of his own age group, and he also makes some very careful distinctions between generations. He continues, young people of my age, born in the 1930s, grew up and started their working careers in the era of physical work, but they got to enjoy, at least the great majority of them, the relief produced by automation before getting exhausted by that work. Luckily, the baby boomers got to enjoy both lighter jobs and social benefits. So he's specific about him not being a baby boomer. Similarly, the next female author structures her life story around awareness about the opportunities open for her generation. However, her judgment is less black and white. Quote, once when I was middle-aged, we drove with my mother past our old little cottage in the woods and thought how lucky we were to be able to move away from there. At the time, I was working long days and I wasn't so sure whether I would have been unhappier as a wife of a small farmer than I was in my neat indoor work as a bureaucrat. Education was perhaps more important for our parents than we, the children, realized at the time. Sure, city life has been easier and wealthier, but deep inside, her heart misses the old village. This narrative could be read as one variation of the cultural script of contrasting countryside and urbanity. For many of these authors, rurality is somehow synonymous with warm, close relationships, and urbanity is classically described as more individual, anonymous, and solitary. Then to my last narrative and last example, the third temporary structure, which is used by the Finnish authors, is connected to the author's need to make their past understandable. The aim to make sense of one's life and to explain why I became me lies in the very heart of autobiographical memory in general. To understand the choices made by the young me, or to understand the circumstances leading to those choices, is important for the last author in my presentation. He was born during evacuation journey. He was the second oldest of 7 siblings. His father had built their home in the middle of forest just before the Second World War. There was no road, no electricity, no plumbing, telephone, or radio. The autobiography is more like a story of survival, beginning with the death of her mother. But in the closing chapter, his autobiography takes a turn. He writes, I drive down the very familiar road to our yard. When I arrive, I see a well-kept birch forest at the end of the road. The buildings that once stood there are all gone. All that is left is a decaying playhouse and what remains of our fireplace. The thought comes to my mind whether all the hard work we have put in has gone to waste. Surely not. Here is where we got the strength for our lives. For this author, it is important to make a reconciliation with the past. He recognizes the importance of his harsh experiences and interprets them in a different way now as a 65-year-old author. Childhood and youth memories are always narrated in a relation to what happened afterwards in the present day. They are also informed by how our ideas about what a good childhood and youth should be have changed. This is another common trait in the rural narratives. Awareness of generational divides goes often hand in hand with a need to teach young generations, or vice versa, with a need to stress how lucky the young generations are, like in this example. He closes his autobiography by stating, "It is my dearest wish that my grandchildren didn't have to experience anything like this in their youth." So, to conclude, now I'm returning back to the concept of generation, which was one inspiration for this online seminar. A pioneer of autobiographical research in Finland, Matti Hyvärinen, has stated that an autobiographical narrative requires both temporal distance and awareness of cultural traditions. To turn back to the discussion about social chains and generations, I could perhaps rephrase that one can place her story in a generational frame only afterwards. When people narrate their life stories, the result is often an intriguing combination of both continuation and change, motivated primarily by an attempt to understand and explain the course of life to oneself. Rather than seeking to define clear-cut generations, I find it fruitful to look at the ways in which generational divides become part of that explanation and narration process. As a concept, generation has two functions in the rural youth narratives of post-war era. On one hand, it is used for referring to something that is recognized and shared by a wider age group of people. On the other hand, it also presupposes differences from the previous generations and later generations. Generational themes may be used in explaining one's own life story, for example, memories of hard manual labor or struggles to gain education become more understandable when they are contextualized in the presumed shared experience of a whole generation. By referring to commonly known historical processes and generational landmarks, people may also try to strengthen the authenticity of their story. The post-war narratives are rich with references to, for example, youth cultural symbols that place the narratives in certain times and certain locations. So as a methodological concept, generation may be outdated, but people still continue to use it and love to place themselves in generations. So thank you.
Thank you, Kaisa. Usually in a face-to-face seminar, there would be a ripple of applause now to the end of your paper. Thank you so much.
Sorry for the technical mess. We didn't notice this on Monday, but well.
That's okay. Almost inevitable, and you dealt with it perfectly. So that's great. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll move straight on to our next presenter, which is Valentina Cuzzocrea from the University of Cagliari. Thank you, Valentina.
Okay, hello. Now I'm trying to share my screen and slides. Okay, screen. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes. Yep. That's working great.
I'll try and put it on presentation. Okay, can you see the full screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go with this version, which is bigger, maybe more visible.
If there's any issues, I'll jump in and interrupt you. Otherwise, this is perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks for the invitation. It really gave me some input to join a discussion that is really dear to me, although with a lot of limitation on my standpoint, which I will tell throughout these 15 minutes. Okay, so I attempted to a title which is The Time of a Generation. My attempt was reading your description of this event to reflect on the concept of social generations and social change, which is obviously very, very big. And I'm going to do this through my own way, which is obviously, the concept of social generation is high in the agenda at the moment, especially as I've seen in Australia with some recent book coming out from some big project like the Life Patterns and some other articles from other daytime projects, which underlines the strengths and limitations of this concept. Some people seem to be more akin to find this as a heuristically valuable concept. Some people less. So there is a high debate on this, which is probably a bit less felt in Europe in a way. And it's a bit more differentiated in terms of the class components that this can take. But I'm not going exactly to discuss this today, but what I'm trying to do is to go back to some reflection that I did in my previous but recent research and published research. What happened in this last month was that I'm amongst the one who didn't feel like I had something sensible to say about what was happening in the pandemic and the COVID-19. I felt, because in the first place, I felt like I was very much affected myself because of how things were changing around me. But obviously, as a sociologist, I observed what was happening and I tried to talk to my students. I had a lot of teaching in these months. And of course, I read newspapers and articles. So although I don't have data dedicated to that, what I'm going to do with you today is to try and reflect on some of the things that I've written on time and youth in light of what has happened in the last months. And in particular, I'm going to reflect with you in terms of time theory about the ruptures and continuities that we face when we study youth, and try and cross the individual level with the collective level that I see around this mechanism. So this presentation is nothing. A structure is a set of reflections that I'm sharing with you, and that comes from this previous recent work, but tries to go in a direction that maybe can develop some of this. So bear with me. My starting point in terms of time theories, and it is an article that I've written recently on sociological research online, where I pointed out that when we study the biographical level at the individual level, we are very often confronted with a lot of studies that put a lot of emphasis on ruptures and discontinuities in young people's lives. So this is very visible through extensive use of some names, some terms such as turning points, critical moments, crossroads, and the like. So this body of literature is really interesting and is really, I would say, imaginative as well. But in that article, I point out that sometimes there is a bit of too strong emphasis on these ruptures, in the sense that the way in which young people see the biographies, especially when they look at the longer terms, is not necessarily tied to these turning points. There might be other things that might be more significant to them, and that, in fact, we as researchers are especially interested in looking at those ruptures because we need them to understand their lives, but maybe we need them more than they do at some point, at least. And in fact, there have been some revisitation of some of these projects, in particular the project by Rachel Thompson and her colleagues, where they go back through the same material throughout some years, and they really make the point that there is the research need to identify those ruptures, to understand these biographical lives. On the other hand, this is a very much justified effort, because we as researchers need to understand how these young people settle down and how they play with their capacity and their resilience, as been pointed out, is a very interesting and very key concept in youth studies to juggle with the difficulties they face. Okay. So, as I said, there is maybe sometimes an excessive focus on the short-term biographical time as well, where the meaning of transition isn't necessarily entirely condensed at a certain point in their lives. And the efforts that we as researchers have done to look at a perspective which is longer term has been, I would say, quantitatively few, and I would pay tribute to the work of Julia here, because she's among the few who has stressed the importance of interlocking these a longer and a medium and a short time dimension, and she uses a word that I really like. She talks about the subservience of a certain kind of future to others. So in that piece, I wanted to call for a stronger attention to that kind of dimension that can allow us as researchers to see that beyond these ruptures, there are also some needs of continuity in the way in which young people conceptualize the future and their biographies at the individual level. On the other hand, this kind of work, which, as I said, are very interesting to read, and are based on the importance of youth resilience, which is, of course, uncontested, also have some delicate political implication, because if we stay too much in celebrating the capacity of young people to tackle with these difficulties and how good they are in solving their lives around them, there is also another part of the other side of the coin, that there is a sort of political legitimation not to work in the direction of sustaining their lives. So this is a caveat that I feel should be done, together with the epistemological issue that we really need to look at these ruptures. But what does it happen when we move from the individual level to the collective level, what I call the time of a generation. If that I described in that article was a kind of an attempt to look at the time of a biography, the timing of a biography, the different timings embedded in a biography at the individual level, what does it happen when we consider a more collective level, which in this presentation would be the concept of social generation. I would say that at the level of epistemological concerns, there also is some kind of researcher bias, in the sense that we want to see how, or even measuring sometimes, how different social generations are, one from the other. And we tend to confront very much with the generation which made the rupture as the key of the time, which is the 1968 generation. So I was recently involved in a study with a colleague from Italy, and we wanted to investigate the Generation Z. And we had some kind of difficulties in finding how we could go with them. How can we see how different Generation Z is from millennials and other generation? You have to invent something that kind of works. And otherwise, all these sort of different but close generations are to be confused. And the epistemological bias here is that in looking at social generation, a lot of times we look at how social generation resist, protest, and do similar kind of actions. So we tend to look at sort of movement studies, or at least in that direction. Or we tend to say that don't do that. There is a lack of protest, a lack of resistance. Of course, this is less true for what pertains the subcultural strand of youth studies. But in the end, if you really want to sum up this kind of studies, of course, you can see that this is a central element. So the question is, how important are continuities and, in contrast, ruptures for this collective level, for the social generation level? How do we actually identify a generation? How does a generation identify itself in the midst of rapid cultural, social, and economic change? Is there such a thing as an intragenerational identity? That's the big question. And one category that would probably come into our mind would be that of generational unit. But as Dan Woodman has noted recently, amongst others, this is so much rooted in class structure that maybe not necessarily is necessarily helpful. So following, of course, the Mannheim base for this line of interpretation, there are some limits. So the concept of generational unit might be one of the weakest within the work of Mannheim. So I'm trying to move this screen down to see the slide better. So the question will be here, how much of a rupture has the pandemic been? And it was really interesting that a few days ago, the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Zizek wrote in Internazionale, which is a magazine, of course, that anti-racial protests following the death of, sorry, I forgot to finish the sentence. The anti-racial protests of these past months have already substituted pandemia, panic, as well as environmental crisis discourses. And in particular, he says that especially the Thunberg's movement and the Friday for the Future movement has already been surpassed by other emergency. And the pandemic already is something from the past, although it's not finished yet. But he notices that none of these three were in fact new inventions. They were latent. We knew that a pandemic could be coming. We knew that there was going to be an environmental crisis behind the door. We knew that interracial issues were going to explode any moment. So this is not really something new. It's just a substitution of issues in the public discourse. And he meant to say that the resurgence of emergency is not a rupture itself, but a climax of pre-existing issues. So I'm not entirely sure that I agree with him. But if we look at how young people have responded during these months to the issues related to the pandemic, there definitely is something to be stressed, which is some kind of continuity that they really want to hold on to. And I'm going to make some example about this in a minute. In fact, in particular, this is something that I read in a newspaper, and it really hit me. It was an excerpt from an interview in a newspaper from a young woman who said, well, living in the quarantine has been like being precarious. We've been precarious for quite a while. We've been used to the fact that we were going to have no job, no security, that we were going to work for basically nothing. And nobody understood us as a generation. It was like we were invisible. But when the quarantine came in and we had to face some other sorts of limitation, like you cannot go out, you cannot do this, you cannot do that, you cannot find solution by yourself, and everything is stuck and you have no ways of juggling around these difficulties. Well, at that point, other people understood. It was like nobody understood precariousness outside of us as young people, but now we can say it's like being precarious. You know, you have no solution but surviving and waiting for some other better times to arrive. And that was really something that she was saying in a collective way. So as precarious, we were not understood. But now that other generation has faced similar limitation, similar in a way, then they might have an idea of what being precarious, being a precarious generation means. The other example that I wanted to do is from the esame di maturità in Italia. Everybody in Italy knows that this is probably the last rite of passage in the youth of students, in the life of students. The name esame di Stato, which is the correct one, has never been surpassed by the traditional one, esame di maturità. So when you finish school, you have to pass through a certain regulation, and then you're actually free to go on with your life. So this is a picture that I took from the internet, which gives an idea of what this collective right is. But what happened this year was that this was invalidated, and in fact it occurred with very different rules. And I wanted to show a picture from a very popular movie that was out in 2006. It's called The Night Before the Exams, Notte prima degli esami, following a very popular song from 1984, where you really get the sense of how much this collective, this rite of passage is collective. So I remember those guys with a guitar, and life is not breaking them. And this night, questa notte ancora nostra, this night is still ours. So it's really something which is our time. It's a night of dreams and championships, of crying and praying together. So it's not like I'm finishing school, I'm doing something after that. It's like actually this is the night of those who are passing this right and this and life is going to be different afterwards because we are going to do other things. So these are two excerpts from two interviews that I found on a newspaper, which has, I mean, there is no sample strategies here. I was just reading newspapers. It's not, you know, interviews, sociological interviews. But it's very clear that a feeling of being stolen their time was there, and so much in other experiences as well. So the first says the opportunity to live these moments to the maximum has been denied to us, but we will look anyway to make it a special night, the night before the exam, to remember we will meet each other, we will keep the mask and social distance and physical distance, and we will wish us good luck for this threshold, which is the end of our adolescence. So she's almost like speaking, speaking in sociological terms, but this is really striking. So there is a very strong stress on the collective meaning of being there together, which has been taken out because of the emergence. So the last, the other example that I wanted to do is from another article that I've taken, that I've written recently, appeared earlier this year in Journal of Youth Studies, where I proposed the pinball metaphor as a way to explicate the mobility in the lives of young people. So the way in which I described the meaning of this metaphor was a way to encapsulate spatiality and movement in young people biographies. So still, again, it is the individual level that I was talking there about, and I proposed the metaphor as a way to talk about the causalization with regard to life planning, and the fact that the movement is really unpredictable and there is no cumulative trajectories. So when you are in this game, you're basically pushed one side and the other, and it's also possible to lose everything with one false move. It is a game. You can lose everything any time. So the suggestion would be, how can we look at the same metaphor here as a way to explicate lack of control on biographical time? So if I use it in that article in terms of the possibility for talking about spatialization and mobility, so a different dimension, can we use it also to talk about the impossibility to control the biographical time? Is this a temporal metaphor akin to explain a generation also that as a father pass? All of a sudden, mobility has ceased to be a possibility to circumnavigate disadvantage, thereby being a resource for young people at the margins or at the periphery, especially. And in fact, we do not know how long it will last if we were getting used to think of mobility as a way to find a solution in our biographies. Now it's like we cannot move anymore, and it's like we have to wait, which is also another category that I've used recently to talk about some sort of marginal young people that in literature used to be especially those confined in global South, and I have argued in a recent article that maybe there are some groups, I'm finishing, maybe there are some groups that are also in the global North that are experiencing these kind of suspensions. So conclusions: attempt to look at ruptures and continuities to which young people are subject might lead us to see their agency, which means to see them as subject. But they reclaim a subjectivity that is not only individual, it is also collective. And this is visible through looking at the times of the generation, what they gained, what they might have lost. And I'm also suggesting to take pandemia as a suggestion for researchers to look more at the conjunction between the individual and the collective level, and the need to look at continuity in ruptures and vice versa too. So I'm done. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Valentina. I'm sorry to pop up and have to stop you earlier. Okay, thank you. So our final presenter for today is Johanna Wing. Johanna, yes, there you are. Thank you for those of you writing questions in the text chat. We're taking notes and we'll get to them after Johanna's presentation. Okay, Johanna, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David. Thank you for the Newcastle Youth Studies Network for this amazing invitation, and it's so great to see so many people. I'd like to express solidarity and empathy with everyone over the COVID-19 crisis, which has affected all of us, no doubt, in various ways. So it's great to be here. I hope to offer an insight in my talk. There's no screen thing coming up, it's just me. I've got a couple of little items I'm going to show you, but otherwise it's not very technical. So I hope to offer an insight into the way in which social theory about youth is employed at critical junctures of social change. And in this way, in some ways, my talk intersects particularly with Valentina's and also with Kaisa's in some ways. To do this, I'm going to draw on some recent work that I'm doing with Anita Harris and Hernan Cuevo in a book with Palgrave titled Thinking About Belonging in Youth Studies. In that work, we drill down through the concepts of social change and generations to look more closely at one of the key conceptual elements that runs through those, a relational register of belonging. Our interest in exploring the genealogy of youth, particularly in looking back in time at how things have developed through youth sociology, through this lens of belonging, we feel reflects a broader contemporary movement in the field of youth studies to seek ways to go beyond the divisions and binaries that have tended to dominate youth research over the last 20 years or so, in order to realise the potential for youth research to be, and this is Andy Furlong's words, a powerful vehicle from which we can explore big issues with implications for social science as a whole. And this could not be, I think, more apposite in the current pandemic. An historical perspective also enables an interrogation of what is meant by social change and what work conceptual tools such as generation and belonging do. So with that in mind, what I want to do is tell you a story about the sociology of youth, which I hope you will find useful for reflecting on the conceptual and methodological tools that we all use. So, how young people belong is often problematised because the young are inevitably bearers of social change. The question of how young people belong has tended to be of much heightened interest at times of perceived dramatic social change, when social anxieties surface about the future. So due to the time constraint here, I'm just going to share the first part of this story, which, as I've said, is a story written for the book with Anita and Hernan. The first part of the story takes us from the 1920s through to the 1950s, I'm going to use 3 short case studies. Although a distinctive youth sociology in Western countries only emerged in the early 1950s, its legacy can be found much earlier in the anxieties about the future at times of widespread social dislocation. Now I'm going to hold up a book, which I hope you can see. There you are. This is my first case study. It's a book written by Chesser, Elizabeth Sloane Chesser, which was published in 1928. It was written a decade after the First World War, in which Chesser explores the implications for generations in the UK. So it's about British young people and British generations. She notes that the First World War left an aftermath of chaos and, in her words, a slackening of moral control and of psychological adjustment. The last war, the greatest the world has ever known in area, numbers, brutalities and consequences, is responsible for many of the mistakes which everybody must admit are being made by young people in the new quarter of the 20th century. She speaks to these and other emerging anxieties about social change and generational conflict to parents who've survived the war and struggle to come to terms with a situation where, as she says, old beliefs, conventional manners and morals are being weighed in the balance and viewed from new angles, and to a new generation who, she says, are unable perhaps to accept the beliefs and ideals of the generation before them, but they are building up for themselves a new sense of values and new perspective. Interestingly, Chesa foreshadows the heightened concerns and the impact of education on young people that accompanied the emergence of mass secondary education in the 1950s. While she expresses a positive view about education, she says that children may replace many of their home standards and values by those of the school, and that children transfer some of the love formerly focused on the parents to teachers. She warns that we give school authorities too much power. So moving on, the 1940s and 50s saw a very wide range of studies of youth and social change published in the UK, the US, Canada and Australia. These studies sought to document and analyse the changing relationship between young people and society against the devastation wrought by World War II and also the emergence of new opportunities post-war. These included universal secondary education, a period of post-war prosperity for many people, as some industries and manufacturing began to recover, and of course the emergence of new forms of older divisions, particularly class and gender. Class in particular, which actually was the focus in the 1950 about the UK. Connell, Francis and Skilbeck, 1957 in Australia. Frydenberg, 1959, Hollingshead, 1948, and Cohen and Short, 1958 in the US, and Mannheim, 1952 in Germany. And there are many others, but I focused on these. What I'm going to do is, this is Hollingshead's book, published in 1948. Appropriately. So his book's important. It undertook a community study of the relationship between the social organ in the middle western corn belt of the US in 1941 and 1942. So it was quite a big study. He studied the lives of almost all the young people in the town. And he framed it as a sociological organises and controls the social behaviour of high school aged adolescents. His approach was explicitly in juxtaposition to the domination of youth research, at which he comments, physiologists have done extensive work on physical maturation. Psychologists have developed a psychology of adolescence. Educators have many studies of the development of young people, particularly from the school's point of view, and sociologists, with few exceptions, have ignored the subject. Against a backdrop of new economic prosperity, Hollingshead concludes that the class structure and neighbourhood subcultures of Elmstown prescribe and control the possibilities and outcomes for young people. And he concludes that the classed nature of American society and the emerging inequalities at this time between families is being rapidly reproduced, and argues that this dynamic is the challenge American society faces in the second half of the 20th century. An interesting insight that seems to strike relevance right now. My third example, looking at the question of social change and youth, is this one. It's focusing on Australian youth. It's by Connell, Francis and Skilbeck. This is Raymond Connell's dad. And Raymond Connell, as a young person, contributed to this book as a research assistant. The imperative to understand the situation of young people at a time of change was central to this work. It's called Growing Up in an Australian City, as you could see, published in 1957, but the study was undertaken in 1951. and it drew quite extensively on the work of some of these earlier people who I've talked about already. The authors were interested in the ways in which an Australian grows up to be an Australian, and the implications of these processes for education and nationhood. In the first place, they were acutely aware of Australia's colonial status, which involved taking a path towards new traditions, as they put it, and a repudiation of the home influence. That means repudiation of British influence. This was seen by the authors as a pivotal moment in history because of the risk of overdependence on the home country, which, in their words, might bring strangulation to initiative in the colony. Actually, we now know there was a missed opportunity here. Anyway, in a tone that foreshadows the interest in insecurity and risk that's dominated youth sociology since the 1980s, these authors refer to the 1950s as a quicksilver age, in which it is not possible to point with security the direction in which the changes are trending, except to say that they are productive of further change. Focusing on the implications for education, they argue that the most urgent developmental tasks for young people were learning to deal with insecurity. They saw, in a significant shift from other studies, they saw the school not as a threat to stability, but concluded instead that schools have the answer. They saw schools as providing youth with the skills of cultural evaluation and judgment, which would enable him, because they're thinking of young men in school, I think, to add his might to the clarification of an urban culture that is far from clear. So this study sees youth at a time of very significant change as the bearers of a post-colonial future, and young people as making active choices that will shape that future. Young people in this study belong in the very centre of the colony's development, guided by a critical education program that addresses their developmental needs as well as those of the emerging nation. Yet, there is a profound statement of unbelonging in this approach, a failure to grasp the deeper implications of social change, so glibly dismissed as colonisation for young people and for Australian society. Young Indigenous Australians are quite simply an absence. Their absence is consistent, of course, with the prevailing ideas of the time, which did not recognise the inalienable relationship between Indigenous Australians and country, the land, the waters, and all living creatures that centrally constitute the spirituality of Indigenous Australians. Writing about Indigenous Australians from the 1920s onwards was informed by the idea that they were inherently more primitive than white Australians. The aim of academic writing, drawing on the emerging disciplines of social anthropology and the eugenics movement, was almost unanimous in positioning the future of Australia's Indigenous people as one of assimilation or annihilation. It's hard to find any writing specifically about young Indigenous people in the period from the 1920s to the 1960s, and there is no recognition of their past or future, except to position them as problematic. Talking more broadly about Australian Indigenous people, cultural anthropologist Elkin in 1937 argued that if Aborigines were to attain a fuller participation in the Australian nation, they had to be assisted over the difficult times of transition from the old Stone Age to that higher stage of culture to which we desire to lead them. Therefore, in stark contrast to the writers like Reid and Chesters and others who we refer to in the book, who saw the increasing institutionalisation of young people in education as constituting a threat to young people's family and spiritual connections, the removal of Australia's Indigenous young people from families and their compulsory participation in educational institutions from 1910 onwards became enshrined in policies that sought to explicitly distance them from their families, country and spiritual connections. So as Morton Robinson explains, the situation of young Indigenous peoples must be theorised in a way which allows for incommensurable differences between the situatedness of Indigenous young people in a colonising settler society such as Australia and those who have come here. Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples are situated in relation to post-colonisation in radically different ways that cannot be made into sameness. So I'd say for Australian youth sociology, the historical legacy of work on youth sets some new agendas for theorising social change, generation and belonging. From the 1980s to the present, social change has provoked a new wave of reflection by youth sociologists about how to account for the situation of young people in ways that acknowledge the significance of political, cultural and economic shifts since the 1980s. You all know about this work, and although we talk about it in detail in the book, I feel you can fill in the gaps for yourselves, and in some ways Valentina and Kaisa have covered some of this ground for me as well. So my time is running out and I won't go into that, but I'll draw my story to a close. Until the 1950s, the project of understanding youth in periods of change tended to be implemented from a broad, holistic perspective, galvanising relatively big studies that had the capacity to range across different areas of life, including the broader social and political context. Questions of the future of nationhood were central. From the 1960s through to the 2000s, the sociology of youth became an increasingly complex field, seeking to recognise the globalising forces of social change in which cultures, education and work became increasingly part of global processes and flows. This was evidenced by smaller scale studies and short-term studies which tended to split off into a focus on cultures or transitions, studies of education, school to work, culture or leisure. While there are exceptions, the field has been dominated by concerns about how young people were creating, participating in and transitioning into a known social and political space. By the mid-2000s, it had become apparent that the inequalities that galvanised early youth studies had become less predictable and more varied. And as some of you have already noted, race has now come much more centrally onto the agenda. Understanding the situation of young people required an understanding of both the changing nature of structural arrangements and institutional processes and the ways in which these were experienced at the subjective level by different groups of young people. This has created an appetite once again for more encompassing and holistic research that acknowledges young people's complex embeddedness in relationships that are personal, simultaneously personal, institutional and political, and that explore the temporal and spatial nature of young people's belonging to their times. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. So in the time that remains to us, we have a range of questions from the audience. I have one myself as the chair, but I think perhaps I'll start with a couple of questions from the audience, and then possibly, if we have time, I might address a question to all of our presenters as well. So perhaps we should just start from the most recent one and move back up. Rob McDonald has a question for all of our speakers, but especially prompted by Valentina's presentation. Rob's asks, does the COVID-19 pandemic provide a good example or case of what we know already in youth studies, e.g. dominant state and public discourses circulating around youth as in trouble, limited youth voice speaking into these discourses, some evidence of shared generational experience and identity, evidence of inequalities and experiences and effects within youth by class, ethnicity and gender, or are there marked differences with what we know being revealed by the pandemic? So since we have Johanna on the screen now, perhaps I'll give Johanna opportunity to respond first. You're muted, Jo. Sorry.
Sorry, I have to unmute. I was trying to be careful about muting.
No worries.
I agree. I think this is a really, it's a really great illustration, and we can expect that there's going to be discourses about youth as victims, and very few opportunities probably for youth voices to be heard more visibly in that. I think it's absolutely right. Although there are some other challenges I think occurring with the demonstrations around race and the sense that not all groups are the same, and it's time to speak out about that. So it's an interesting space to watch that in.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Johanna. Do either of our other two presenters want to respond to Rob? Just turn on your camera if you want to say something. Yep. Okay, fair enough. So Valentina?
Yes, this is a really complex question to answer, but I followed some of the things that were happening in the UK, and I have the impression that there really are some important differences in between countries. So in Italy, for instance, there has been a lot of accusation about youth, like not really caring about what was happening and kind of cheating in relation to the regulation, which I think have been exaggerated quite a lot. So it might be different in the UK, where the education system in particular is very different. But it's really a good question to bring home, I would say. I have the impression that it's really country specific as the reply that we might give. Thanks, Rob.
Okay. Kaisa, did you want to respond to that question?
Well, I agree. It's a wonderful question. And I think I also wish to thank Valentina for your talk, because you really addressed the questions related to generations and the COVID-19 pandemic in a brilliant way. And I agree with you that there are huge differences between countries. And I have to say that because Finland hasn't been affected so severely as some other countries, you can already start seeing how the pandemic talk is vanishing, although we don't really know what is going to happen next. And you can't find exactly the same discussion about youth in relation to the pandemic in Finland, but there are certainly differences between the countries, and that's important. And also how inequalities in societies have been revealed through the pandemic. That's really interesting for me.
Okay. Julia Cook has a question for Valentina specifically. Julia asks, the notion of waithood for all age cohorts rather than just youth is really interesting. In your opinion, could this aspect of the pandemic potentially support intergenerational empathy? And do the economic implications of the pandemic pose the risk of eroding empathy for precarious lives?
That's also another big, good question. I would say, as a first reaction, what is happening, at least in Italy, is that the kind of intergenerational war has been exacerbated, I would say, because the resources to tackle with all the economic crisis that comes with the pandemic are really limited, of course, especially in some areas of the country, and especially in the negotiation with the rest of the European Union. So everybody, I think, is struggling to get as much economic resource as possible, and that is probably the first reaction. What would go with more cultural level in terms of understanding each other more? It's probably a bit early to say. I would say that as a first reaction, as it normally happens when there are few resources around, is like try and capture the resources that are there. And then it would take a bit more time to understand more cultural dynamics. So I wouldn't really know how to answer now.
Okay, thanks, Valentina. I have a question for all of our presenters, which speaks to something which I think everybody dealt with differently, which is the way that the notion of generation operates in different sociological accounts. In one sense, we've got the concept of generation, which is deployed in order to understand substantive structural changes, all of which were discussed in a substantive way by all of our participants. Everything from the consequences of the First World War, contemporary precarity, or Kaisa's participants who lived through enormously rapid urbanization and industrialization. But on the other hand, one of the things that everybody's raised is the complex nature of generation talk as a way of making sense of people's lives, as a way that people make sense of their own lives retrospectively, and also as a way that researchers identify what's significant for them. So Valentina's critique of the notion of critical moments, I think, speaks to the way that generation talk is also a specific kind of narrative. And one of the implications of the early literature that Johanna mentions is that, in a sense, people are talking about rapid generational change constantly, rather than just at the moments that we, in contemporary youth studies, identify as significant. And Kaisa's work, I think, really speaks to the way that there are these symbols and narratives that people use to make their own biographies intelligible to themselves and to others, which can include generation talk, but which aren't necessarily directly connected with, concrete large-scale structural changes, although they may be. So I wonder if all of our participants could comment on this kind of tension between generation talk as a way of identifying structural change and generation talk as a complex and perhaps in some ways problematic way of retrospectively narrating the past and one's own biography. Whoever turns their camera on can respond to me first. If you feel like you want to respond to that question, of course.
Maybe I could start, and just something that I was thinking about when I was writing this presentation. I was thinking about also the disciplinary differences. And to me, it seems that in historical research, researchers find it more comfortable to talk about social change in terms of generation, and the concept can be used for referring to a certain group of people who were born in the same time and witnessed the same period. And you don't have to necessitate a joint generation sense of belonging to a generation. Whereas in the sociological research, I think the emphasis has been on the sense of belonging to the same generation. And then we enter the difficult discussions about when one generation starts and when it ends, and thus do certain people belong to a certain generation or not, which I think is really a never-ending discussion, because you can find change and continuity everywhere. And I agree with Valentina that it's really important to pay attention also to the continuities in young people's life. But absolutely, I think, David, that you captured the tensions very well. We kind of need to use the concept of generation when conceptualizing structural changes, and at the same time we have this thing about identifying and using the generational talk as making one's own life understandable. And maybe we just need two different concepts for those things.
Okay, thanks. Valentina or Johanna, do you have any thoughts?
Okay, I'll say a few things. I can see Valentina looking at the screen to see if if someone else pops up. But yeah, I was I used the example of the 1957 study of Australian youth explicitly because of the way that the researchers characterised the 1950s, which we all think as, you know, that was really the kind of stable point on the planet when for a while things stayed stable, to refer to it as a liquid age where everything was changing, and the most important thing that young people could learn would be to be able to cope with insecurity. And in doing that, I was really trying to draw attention to the fact that academics use this as a device, I suppose, to point to something big, something significant that that they see the new generation accommodating to in ways that are sometimes scary, sometimes unpredictable. So it is an academic device that's used. I think at the everyday level, of course, people use the concept of generation in an everyday sense as part of their narrative of their life. So there's some different things going on. The term is both a term that's used by marketing organisations, it's used in everyday language, and it's used in academic language in very different ways. Yeah, and it's got some value, as you know, I've argued in the past, as a concept that enables us to tie individual biographies to structural change. But of course, that is different for different groups, and that's one reason why I also wanted to pick up on the issue of Indigenous Australians, because the questions about what generation means there, and what social change means for young Indigenous Australians is an important question that will cut across other narratives. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Johanna. Valentina, did you want to respond?
Yeah, maybe quickly. Of course, there are a lot of important tensions, but if we look at this part of structural changes that the pandemic has brought now, I would say, of course, it is extraordinary, deep, and it's revolutionizing the life of so many people across the world. But on the other hand, and of course, it's very much tied to the position of young people in several ways, as I see in the question on the screen. But on the other hand, we are not really sure how long it's going to last. So let's say there's going to be a very deep impact, definitely for the next 1 year. I don't know, maybe we want to be very optimistic about it. We want to think that in 2 years' time, this will be gone as an issue, and we will remember it as something from the past. I don't know, but in terms of structural changes, we don't know that time trajectories of this in the future. We don't know it yet because we don't have a vaccine yet, and we don't know how whether the pandemic is going to come back and how long it's going to last. But one thing is for sure, that it has changed the perception, the imaginary of what young people can do and cannot do at the moment. So for instance, some of us are doing work on mobility, and mobility at the moment, you don't really know when you can start moving again in different sort of ways. So it's changing this perception for sure, but the structural level, if we are very lucky, might actually have a shorter life than this imaginary. This is my impression.
Okay, thanks, Valentina. Kim Allen has a question. Kim says that she likes the pinball metaphor and thinks it's really valuable to think about the uncertainty of life planning. I'm wondering how this metaphor can account for issues of social class, race, and gender in regards to how young people may be differently buffered by a lack of control and precarity, or some may be able to more safely bounce back from changes in life plans within that kind of pinball metaphor. Do you want to comment on that, Valentina? Don't forget to unmute.
I first thought about this metaphor because I was reflecting on social acceleration of time. And then I use it in a way that could be referred to speciality and mobility, as I said. On the other hand, it's not really totally new, as I said, in the sense that there have been some metaphors before that, like the yo-yo metaphor, which has been used extensively in Europe, and it's about 10 years old, I think, which talks about the possibility to go back and go back, to go forward and go back again. So this idea of bouncing back. But the pinball, I think, in my idea, adds a bit more in terms of putting together both the temporality and the spatial dimension of this uncertainty and insecurity. Again, if we talk about structural lines like social class, race, and gender, again, we have to say that maybe gender less, and race less as well, but at least social class has very different meanings if we think about different countries in Europe, and I'm sure, of course, outside of Europe as well. So the impact of the structural part and structural inequalities might be different in different countries. So for instance, in Italy, the importance of the family and familism, which is not exactly saying a social class, is still very prevalent. And for instance, when I talked to my students in these months and they were doing the quarantine, having come back to their parents' house, I realized that there were different issues coming out. But it was not like necessarily a social class matter. It was how they understood their relations with their parents and coming back to their parents, because this is where they reside, so they had to go back. They could not continue their life as a we say for the distance students with the others. So again, it's a question that has to be addressed depending on the national context in the first place.
Okay, thanks. Well, it is now 30 past the hour. What hour it is depends also on the national context. So I think we should wrap up for today. But I just want to finish by saying, first of all, I would encourage you to keep these, usually at conferences, we keep conversations going at lunch or whatever. I'm sure that the digital world offers us opportunities to keep these conversations going after the workshop is finished. Please join me in silently thanking our participants, or whatever we do in the contemporary moment to thank participants in events like this. It's been a fantastic workshop, so thanks everyone for coming along, and please look out for the next installment in this series, which will be advertised on social media, you can rest assured. So thank you very much, and I look forward to keeping in touch. Farewell.